Bawani, everybody. My name is Chief Babagua Abilori, meaning the man who stands with kings. I'm also called Afrothinktank. And today I want to come to you with a special video. I've made a video like this before, but I think it's very important that I come to you presented this way when it comes to the information I'm going to disseminate to you today. Okay? We as African Americans, we as African diasporans all over the world have been disenfranchised when it comes to our identity. We take on the identity of everybody else and we try to use other people's identity as a source of power and inspiration for ourselves. And we don't always take upon our own identity. It's not through any fault of our own, it's because we were stripped of who we are. We don't know who we are per se, and because we don't know who we are, we pretend to be everything else. We pretend to be Native Americans. We pretend to be white Western Christians. We pretend to be Asian Muslims and Islamic people. We never use our own religions, our own story, our own foundation of our African identity to empower ourselves. And when that happens and we take on all these other identities, we get mixed up and we get confused. And when we don't have a solid foundation of oneself, we tend to trip up as we go on the journey of discovery. And one issue that I have a very big issue, and I'm going to try to explain it before I get into the presentation, is that we Africans, Americans, we African people are not Jews. Let me say this again. We are not Jews. And that's one of the things that upsets me the most, is that we have all these African people identifying with a false group of people from a place that was just created not even 100 years ago. And it seems like we don't take history seriously. It seems that all the information is there to be seen, yet we don't take that in consideration when we go down these rabbit holes of these fantasies of these things that we want to be. And we neglect the actual truth that's greater and richer than any fantasy that we've created, any fantasy that we've adopted from our oppressors. Keep in mind, as African people around the world, we have adopted the religions of our oppressors. We have adopted the positions and ideologies of our oppressors. We have adopted the mindset of our oppressors. Christianity and Islam is the worst thing to ever happen to African people, as they are not consistent with real African culture. They are a carbon copy of true African culture. And what I want to do today is talk about who the real people are, who are now being called or misidentified or misclassified as Jews. They were misplaced and they were put in a different geographical location, and they were described in different ways, and it got us all looking crazy and confused as you see these weirdos standing in corners wearing Power Ranger suits talking about the Hebrew Israelites, disrespecting Africans and trying to disconnect themselves from Africa. Pretendians are not the first African people to try not to be African. They're just one in many lines of people who tried to create identities because they didn't know who they were. But let me tell you, African American, who you are. Let me tell you, Diaspora, who you are. You're not the Jews. You're Igbo. You're Yoruba. That's who you are. And the Jews, these people that you call the Jews, all these stories in the Bible that you read, all those stories where they try to place everything in the corner into a racially ambiguous mixed area where Africans, Asians, and Europeans coalesced because of trade. They try to have these mixed racially ambiguous people, giving them space and room to try to make them quasi-European so they can have it in their perspective, so it can fit right in their narrative. The truth is, everything that happened in that Bible happened in Africa. Everything that happened, it happened in Africa. Everything that happened in that Quran happened in Africa. Islam and Christianity are carbon copies of various different African traditions. Those are African stories. But the problem is the names have been changed. All the terms have been slightly altered. But the peoples and the tribes of those of those people in the Bible, in the Quran, are African tribes that have African names that still have the same names today, like Igbo. So today I'm going to present you with the group of people, with the kingdom that is being miscategorized and relocated and renamed to be called the Jews. I'm going to show you who the Igbos are. The precursors to who we know as the Igbos are African American direct ancestors, because African Americans specifically, 80% of us are by way of Nigeria. We are Nigerians. The people of Nigeria, a multicultural, multi-ethnic, rich geographical area that have multiple kingdoms with rich history that's there for us to explore. All we have to do is open our eyes and see the truth, so we can start calling ourselves what we actually are and start using these false terms like Jews and Hebrew Israelites. We don't need any of that. We are the tribe. We are the Igbo. We are the Yoruba. If you listen to the Yoruba, if you look at Yoruba Yoruba history, you would see that the Yoruba know they come directly from and are ancestors of those great ancient black African Egyptians. Only if you knew. We have a lot of African Americans who like to skip West Africa and go straight to North Africa. They like to skip and go straight to Egypt because for some reason they feel a connection. Now, African Americans have been the gatekeeper of African history so far. And we've done a great job to make sure Europeans don't solidify the lie that they had anything to do with our great African culture. But I employ our African Americans to reconnect with your mother and your father, and don't skip them for your grandfather and your grandmother, Egypt and Nubia. You must embrace and appreciate your West African culture and then follow that culture as they talk about their history. You see, our ancient ancestors have ancient ancestors. Our Yoruba ancestors have ancestors that they talk about. And those ancestors that they talk about are the ancestors that we skip them for and go straight to. Our Yoruba brothers and sisters, one of the most disrespected groups of Africans in Africa, are the real so-called quote-unquote Jews. The kingdom in West Africa is the real quote-unquote Israel, but it wasn't called Israel. And we're going to get to that because I'm going to tell you everything about this wonderful, wonderful kingdom, this wonderful, wonderful place that you never heard of. I'm going to tell you about a people that you have never heard of. And you're going to be shocked. And you're going to wonder why you never learned about this in school. You're going to wonder why nobody talks about this. This might be one of the most suppressed pieces of historical information ever to be hidden. If you want to talk about something hidden, this is hidden. And as Africans, if we truly want to empower ourselves, what we need to do is take hold of our actual identity and appreciate the actual people who inspired all these religions, who inspired all these movements, who inspired all these people, like a domino effect. We need to start using our big African lips to say African words in an African way. We need to use our big genius African brains and African geniuses to appreciate our own African accomplishments so that we can empower ourselves with the foundation of us so that nobody else can disrespect us. It's our time now. This is the age of information. There's no lies that can hold water in this age. The truth is coming out. And it's my duty as a historian, as a college-educated historian and Rhodes Scholar myself, it's my duty to teach my people because we know our educational system is not going to do it. It's not good enough just to complain that our educational system is not teaching us about African history. Those people making the complaints need to be the people that's actually making the effective change. So I chose to be that teacher that I wish I had when I was young, so that somebody else who's watching me can learn about their history, learn about who they are, appreciate and have pride for who they are. Real pride, warrior pride, spiritual pride, intellectual pride. social pride, racial pride, black national pride about who they are, so that nobody else could belittle us. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about this great culture that's been hidden and stolen by the Europeans. All the artifacts stolen by the Europeans. The most valuable artifacts in the world are African artifacts. I'm going to tell you this before we get to the story. The most valuable artifacts are African artifacts. The most valuable things on the earth come from Africa. From ancient times to now, Africa is still the place where the most valuable items, people, and things are. But in order for other people to take and steal and utilize those items, those things, they have to belittle those people who own those things. These things belong to us. And they stole these things. They admire these things. They worship these things in their museums. They worship these things in their universities. They study these things. They study the science of Africans, and then they call it European discovery. They study the spiritual science of Africans, then they create a new one and call it their religions and say that they discovered this. All the great Europeans, the Greeks, who the Europeans revere as the beginners of civilization, the beginners of those European Anglo-Saxon civilizations. Every one of those scholars got all their information from universities in Africa. And they all unapologetically, with no shame, admitted it. Because back then, it wasn't an issue of race. Africans built the Greek societies. Africans taught them how to look into their soul and feel their spiritualness. Everything about the Greek culture is a carbon copy of African culture. Everything about the Catholic Church is a carbon copy of African culture. Everything is a copy of us. And we need to start appreciating us, the original, the root of all these things. These perverted versions of the things that was purely made by us. Now, am I saying that everything that Africans have done is good? No. Is every tradition, every religious organization, and every practice in history is something that we should revamp and re-practice today? No, because they are things that we need to let go and advance past as human beings. We are going towards the future. We are going towards the future. And in the future, things are going back to black. And when things go back to black, we need to also get our minds back to black. So without further ado, let's get into this presentation, because it's time for us to reorient ourselves to show you who the real spiritual arbiters of the souls of humanity are. And we are not the Jews. The Jews are a carbon copy of these people. Without further ado, let's get into the presentation.
The Kingdom of Nri, Igbo, Oris Nri, was a medieval polity located in what is now Nigeria. The kingdom existed as a sphere of religious and political influence over a significant part of what is known today as Igbo land prior to expansion, and was administered by a priest king called an Nri. The Nri managed trade and diplomacy on behalf of the Nri people, a subgroup of the Igbo-speaking people, and possessed divine authority in religious matters. The kingdom was a haven for all those who had been rejected in their communities, and also a place where slaves were set free from their bondage. Nri expanded through converts gaining neighboring communities' allegiance, not by force. Nri's royal founder, Eri, is said to be a sky being that came down to earth and then established civilization. One of the better-known remnants of the Nri civilization is manifested in the Igbo Oku artifacts. Nri's culture permanently influenced the northern and western Igbo, especially through religion and taboos. The kingdom appears to have passed its peak in the 18th century, encroached upon by the rise of the Benin and Igola kingdom, and later the Atlantic slave trade, but it appears to have maintained its authority well into the 16th century. Remnants of the East hierarchy persisted until the establishment of colonial Nigeria in 1911, and it continues to exist as one of the traditional states within modern Nigeria. History. The Nri Kingdom is a kingdom within the Igbo area of Nigeria. Nri and Agulari, where the Umuri Igbo creation myth originates, are in the territory of the Umueri clan, who trace their lineages back to the patriarchal king figure, Eri. Eri's origin is unclear, though he has been described as a sky being sent by Chukwu, God. He is credited with first giving societal order to the people of Anambra. NRI history may be divided into 6 main periods: the pre-Eri period, the Eri period, migration and unification, the heyday of NRI influence, decline and collapse, and the socio-cultural revival, 1974, present. Foundation. Eastern Hemisphere at the end of the 12th century CE, showing NRI and other civilizations. Author Nwediogwu suggested that NRI influence in Igbo land may go back as far as the 12th century, and royal burials have been unearthed dating to at least the 9th century. According to other authors, Eri, the godlike founder of NRI, is believed to have settled the region around the 1500s. The first is Nri, king of Nri, Ifikwanem, follows directly after him. According to Angulu, 1981, oral tradition suggests an accession of Eri in 1043, contradictory. Chambers, 2005, places Ifikwanem's reign at around 1225 C. In 1911, the names of 19 Nri were recorded, but the list is not easily converted into chronological terms because of long interregnums between installations. Tradition held that at least 7 years would pass upon the death of the Nri before a successor could be determined. The interregnum served as a period of divination of signs from the deceased Nri, who would communicate his choice of successor from beyond the grave in the 7 or more years ensuing upon his death. Regardless of the actual date, this period marks the beginning of Nri kingship as a centralized institution. Zenith and fall. Expansion of the Kingdom of Nri was achieved by sending Birichi, or converts, to other settlements. Allegiance to the Nri was obtained not by military force but through ritual oath. Religious authority was vested in the local king, and ties were maintained by traveling Birichi. By the late 16th century, Nri influence extended well beyond the nuclear northern Igbo region to Igbo settlements on the west bank of the Niger and communities affected by the Benin Empire. There is strong evidence to indicate Igbo influence well beyond the Igbo region to Benin and southern Egola areas like Ida before the arrival of the Nri. At its height, the Kingdom of Nri had influence in over roughly a fourth of Igbo land and beyond. Nri's influence in much of northwestern and western Igbo land lasted from the reigns of the 4th Nri to that of the 9th. After that, patterns of conflict emerged that existed from the 10th to the 14th reigns, which probably reflected the monetary importance of the slave trade. Outside world influence was not going to be halted by native religious doctrine in the face of the slave trade's economic opportunities. Nri influence declined after the start of the 18th century. Still, it survived in a much reduced and weakened form until 1911, when an expedition carried out by British colonial troops forced the reigning Nri to renounce the ritual power of the religion known as the Ikenga, ending the Kingdom of Nri as a political power. Protected. The influence of these symbols and institutions extended well beyond Nri, and this unique Igbo socio-political system proved capable of controlling areas wider than villages or towns. For many centuries, the people within the Nri-related areas were committed to peace. This religious pacifism was rooted in a belief that violence was an abomination which polluted the earth. Instead, the Nri could declare a form of excommunication from the Ordinary Nri against those who violated specific taboos. Members of the Ikenga could isolate entire communities via this form of ritual siege. Nri. Nri Oberlike sounding his bell. The Nri was the title of the ruler of Nri with ritual and mystic, but not military, power. He was a ritual figure rather than a king in the traditional sense. The Nri was chosen after an interregnum period where the electors waited for supernatural powers to manifest in the new Nri. He was installed after a symbolic journey to Agulari on the Anambra River. The authorities must be notified prior to commencement of this journey to obtain the Oduduis, the royal scepter. There, the process of paying of homage to all the necessary shrines/deities in Agulari by the new Nri, visitation to Menri's tomb at Omokpu, collection of Ofo, purification of the virgin boy to receive the clay from the chosen diver from Umuziora in Agulari, sitting on the throne of Eri at Obugad in Enugu Agulari by the new Nri before going back to Nri on the 7th day to undergo a symbolic burial and exhumation, then finally be anointed with white clay, a symbol of purity. Upon his death, he was buried seated in a woodland chamber. The Nri was in all aspects a divine ruler. Ikenga. While the Nri lived relatively secluded from his followers, he employed a group of officials called Nri. These were ritual specialists, easily identifiable by facial scorifications or ichi, who traveled with ritual staffs of peace in order to purify the earth from human crimes. The Nri exercised authority over wide areas of Igbo land and had the power to install the next Nri. Areas under Nri influence, called Odinoni Nri, were open to Nri traveling within them to perform rituals and ensure bountiful harvest or restore harmony in local affairs. Men within the Odinoni Nri could represent the Nri and share his moral authority by purchasing a series of rank titles called Ozo and Ens. Men with these titles were known as Mirichi and became an extension of the Nri's religio-political system. They controlled the means for agriculture and determined guilt or innocence in disputes. Both the Nri priest and Mirichi nobility belonged to the Ikenga, the right hand. The Ikenga god was one dedicated to achievement and power, both of which were associated with the right hand. Economy. Nri maintained its vast authority well into the 16th century. The peace mandated by the Nri religion and enforced by the presence of the Mirichi allowed trade to flourish. Items such as horses, which did not survive in tsetse fly-infested Nri, and seashells, which would have to be transported a long ways due to Nri's distance from the coast, have been found depicted in Nri's bronze. A Nri dignitary was unearthed with ivory, also indicating a wealth in trade existed among the Nri. Another source of income would have been the income brought back by traveling Mirichi. Unlike in many African economies of the period, Nri did not practice slave ownership or trade. Certain parts of the Nri domain did not recognize slavery and served as a sanctuary. After the selection of the 10th Nri, any slave who set foot on Nri soil was considered free. Nri had a network of internal and external trade, which its economy was partly based on. Other aspects of Nri's economy were hunting and agriculture. Eri, the sky being, was the first to count the days by their names, Ik, Oi, Afro and Ko, which were the names of their four governing spirits. Eri revealed the opportunity of time to the Igbo, who would use the days for exchanging goods and knowledge. Art. 9th century bronze vessel in form of a snail shell excavated in Igbo-Oku, in Nigerian National Museum, Lagos. Igbo-Oku, a part of the kingdom about 18 kilometers, 11 miles, south of Nri itself, practiced bronze casting techniques using elephant head motifs. The bronzes of Igbo-Oku are often compared to those of Ife and Benin, but they come from a different tradition and are associated with the Nri by descendants of Eri. 11. In fact, the earliest body of Nigerian bronzes has been unearthed in Igbo territory to the east of the Niger River at a site dated to the 9th century, making it older than Ife. It appears that Nri had an artistic as well as religious influence on the lower Niger. Sculptures found there are bronze like those at Igbo-Oku. The great sculptures of the Benin Empire, by contrast, were almost always brass with, over time, increasingly greater percentages of zinc added. The bronzes of Igbo-Oku pay special attention to detail depicting birds, snails, chameleons, and other natural aspects of the world, such as a hatching bird. Other pieces include gourds and vessels, which were often given handles. The pieces are so fine that small insects were included on the surfaces of some, while others have what looks like bronze wires decorated around them. None of these extra details were made separately, the bronzes were all one piece. Igbo-Oku gave the evidence of an early bronze casting tradition in Nri. Religion. Religious beliefs were central to the Kingdom of Nri. NRI oral tradition states that a bounty of yams and cocoa yams could be given to the Is NRI, while blessings were given in return. It was believed that NRI's influence and bountiful amount of food was a reward for the ruler's blessings. Above all, NRI was a holy land for those Igbo who followed its edicts. It served as a place where sins and taboos could be absolved just by entering it. Even Igbo living far from the center of power would send abnormal children to NRI for ritual cleansing rather than having them killed, as was sometimes the case for dwarfs or children who cut their top teeth before their lower teeth. NRI people believed that the sun was the dwelling place of Enyamyu, light, and Agbola, fertility. Agbola was the collective spirit of all holy beings, human and non-human. Agbola was the perfect agent of Chokwu or Chinik, the creator god, and chose its human and non-human agents only by their merit. It knew no politics. It transcended religion, culture, and gender, and worked with the humble and the truthful. They believed Enyamyu, the light, to be the symbol of human perfection that all must seek, and Agbola was entrusted to lead man there. Tradition. NRI tradition was based on the concept of peace, truth, and harmony. It spread this ideology through the ritualistic Ozo traders who maintained NRI influence by traveling and spreading NRI practices such as the Aikno to other communities. These men were identified through the ritual facial scarifications they had undergone. NRI believed in cleansing and purifying the earth, a supernatural force to NRI called honor and ajona of human abominations and crimes. Year counting ceremony. The Igu Ero Festival, counting of the year, was a royal festival the Is NRI used to maintain his influence over the communities under his authority. Each of these communities sent representatives to pay tribute during the ceremony to show their loyalty. At the end, the Is NRI would give the representatives a yam medicine and a blessing of fertility for their communities. The festival was seen as a day of peace, and certain activities were prohibited such as the planting of crops before the day of the ceremony, the splitting of wood, and unnecessary noise. Igu Ero was a regular event that gave an opportunity for the East to speak directly to all the communities under him. NRI scarification. An Igbo man with facial marks of nobility known as Ichi. Ritual scarification in NRI was known as Ichi, of which there are two styles, the NRI style and the Agbeja style. In the NRI style, the carved line ran from the center of the forehead down to the chin. A second line ran across the face, from the right cheek to the left. This was repeated to obtain a pattern meant to imitate the rays of the sun. In the Agbeja style, circles and semicircular patterns are added to the initial incisions to represent the moon. These scarifications were given to the representatives of the Is NRI, the Mirichi. The scarifications were NRI's way of honoring the sun that they worshipped and was a form of ritual purification. Scarification had its origins in NRI mythology. NRI, the son of Eri who established the town of NRI, was said to have pleaded to Chokwu, the great god, because of hunger. Chokwu then ordered him to cut off his first sons and daughters' heads and plant them, creating a blood bond between the Igbo and the earth deity, Honor. Before doing so, NRI was ordered to mark Ichi onto their two foreheads. Cocoa yam, a crop managed by females, sprang from his daughter's head, and yam, the Igbo people's staple crop, sprung from his son's head. Chokwu had taught NRI plant domestication. From this, the Is NRI's first son and daughter were required to undergo scarifications 7 days after birth, with the Is NRI's daughter being the only female to receive Ichi. NRI, the son of Eri, also gained knowledge of the yam medicine, Oguji. People from other Igbo communities made pilgrimages to NRI in order to receive this knowledge received in exchange for annual tributes. Igbo Americans, or Americans of Igbo ancestry, Igbo, the Igbo in America, are residents of the United States who identify as having Igbo ancestry from modern-day Nigeria. There are primarily two classes of people with Igbo ancestry in the United States: those whose ancestors were taken from Igbo land as a result of the transatlantic slave trade before the 20th century, and those who immigrated from the 20th century onwards partly as a result of the Nigerian Civil War in the late 1960s and economic instability in Nigeria. Igbo people prior to the American Civil War were brought to the United States by force from their hinterland homes on the Bight of Biafra and shipped by Europeans to North America between the 17th and 19th centuries. Identified Igbo slaves were often described by the ethnonyms Igbo and Igbo, a colonial American rendering of Igbo. Some Igbo slaves were also referred to as Bites, denoting their Bight of Biafra origin, and other names were used in reference to their homelands in Africa. Their presence in the United States was met with mixed feelings by American plantation owners because of their rebellious attitudes to enslavement. Many of the enslaved Igbo people in the United States were concentrated in Virginia's lower tidewater region, and at some point in the 18th century they constituted over 30% of the enslaved black population. Igbo culture contributed to the Creolist African American culture and is perhaps evident in such cultural vestiges as the Junkanoo Parade of North Carolina. Igbo Americans introduced the Igbo word okra into the English language. The recent migrant population from Nigeria settled in many of the United States' larger cities and urban centers and had come largely in search of economic opportunities in the late 20th century. Because of the realities of slavery and its erasure of African heritage and customs, most people who identify as Igbo in the United States and speak the Igbo language at home are from these families that arrived in the 20th century and fought. The Igbo were affected heavily by the Atlantic slave trade in the 18th century. Enslaved Igbo were known for being rebellious and having a high count of suicide in defiance of slavery. In the United States, the Igbo were most numerous in the state of Maryland, coincidentally where there is a predominant population of recent Igbo immigrants, and Virginia, so much so that some historians have denominated colonial Virginia as Igbo land. With a total of 37,000 Africans that arrived in Virginia from Calabar in the 18th century, 30,000 were Igbo according to Douglas B. Chambers. The Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia estimates around 38% of captives taken to Virginia were from the Bight of Biafra. Igbo peoples constituted the majority of enslaved Africans in Maryland. Chambers has been quoted saying, "My research suggests that perhaps 60% of Black Americans have at least one Igbo ancestor." Virginia was the colony that took in the largest percentage of Igbo slaves. Researchers such as David Eltis estimate between 30 and 45% of the imported slaves were from the Bight of Biafra. Of these slaves, 80% were likely Igbo. A so-called conservative estimate of the amount of Igbo taken into Virginia between 1698 and 1778 is placed at 25,000. The Igbo concentration was especially high in the Tidewater and Piedmont regions of the Virginia interior. One of the reasons for this high number of Igbo slaves in Virginia was the domination of the Bight of Biafra region of Africa by Bristol and Liverpool English merchants who frequently brought Bight of Biafra slaves to British colonies, Virginia being one of these colonies. The high concentration of Igbo slaves in Virginia was contributed to further by neighboring states. Planters in South Carolina and Georgia looked down on Igbo slaves because many were rebellious. Because of this, the majority of Igbo slaves were taken and sold to Virginian planters. Some possible Igbo names were also found among slave records in Virginia. Names found in records such as Anika or Aneki, Brichi and Juba may originate respectively from the Igbo names Neka, meaning the mother is superior, and Birichi, male members of the Kingdom of Nri, and Jiogba, meaning Yamban. Some had their ethnicity added to their names, such as Ebo Sera and Plain Igbo. These hints of Igbo influence go along with cultural remnants pointing towards the Igbo presence in Virginia, one of which is the use of the Ebo drum in music. The Igbo presence in Virginia also brought new practices, such as the cultivation of okra, a plant whose name derives from the Igbo language. Slaves in Virginia relied on sweet potato, which is argued by Douglas Chambers to be an indication of a substitute for yam, the Igbo staple crop. Kentucky. The state of Kentucky, which was carved out of the colony of Virginia, had received many of Virginia's slave drivers and slaves as people started migrating westward. These migrations spread out the population of African slaves in America, including Igbo slaves. Here the Igbo population had already become heavily creolized alongside other African ethnicities that were taken in significant numbers to America. Culture. African cultures were heavily suppressed in the United States. The plantation and slave owners made sure to suppress African cultures through intimidation and torture, stripping away slaves' names and heritage. As expected, Igbo culture faced the same oppression. However, some cultural remnants of Igbo origin was found and can still be found in the United States. Most of these cultural remnants can be found in music and entertainment. Igbo culture manifested in America through the Jonkonu festivals that once took residence in the black slave population in Virginia. This masquerade bears similarity with the masking traditions of the Okonko secret society, who still operate in the Igbo hinterland. The maskers wear horns, which further shows similarity to Igbo culture and their Ekno deity. Heavily African-influenced American music genres such as jazz and ragtime stem from a mix of African cultures that creolized in the Americas. Although these genres could be described as a mix, there are elements of American music that have specific origin and Igbo instruments, such as the Ebo drum. The Igbo OPI flute is similar to the drum and fife traditions. The novel Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe follows the story of Okonko, an Igbo leader and warrior. The novel alludes to many of the customs and historical happenings of post-colonial Igbo culture. The book has been critically acclaimed, often being referenced as the archetypal African novel written for the Western world. Igbo landmarks in America. The language spread of Kru, Igbo, and Yoruba in the United States according to U.S. Census 2000. Igbo Village in Virginia. The Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia has completed an Igbo single-family farmers compound to acknowledge the prevalence of the Igbo in 19th century Virginia. Igbo Landing. Igbo Landing is a historic site in Dunbar Creek of St. Simons Island, Glynn County, Georgia, United States. In 1803 it was the location of a mass suicide by Igbo slaves in resistance to slavery in the United States, and is of symbolic importance in African American folklore and literary history.
Thanks for watching. This is Afro Think Tank. Learn something, teach something. I'm out.